To the sons who carried this name, that's what my father toasted, his voice proud, clear, final. I stood 3 tables away, holding a glass of water. No, thank you for my orbital systems work. No mention that I helped land a contract he bragged about just minutes before. Just, to the sons, and the room applauded. That's when I realized I wasn't invited to the story he told about us. So I wrote a new one, quietly, with no need for a spotlight. If you've ever been the one left out of the sentence, but expected to stay for the toast, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, you're lucky. Drop a 0. Because sometimes the most radical thing a daughter can do is choose herself. I ironed the navy dress twice, not because it needed it, but because I needed something that obeyed me. The iron glided silently over the fabric, leaving behind a faint scent of steam and lavender starch. I focused on the hiss, the way it broke the hush of the hotel room like a tiny release valve. Everything else in my life felt unbending, untouchable. But this dress, this stubborn wrinkle near the shoulder seam, it gave. I pressed harder. On the desk behind me sat a green velvet box. It had traveled with me across states, buried in a tote between old scarves and the travel-size deodorant I still hadn't replaced. I'd nearly left it at home, twice. Now it waited beside my phone and the folded speech I still hadn't committed to. The room was warm with artificial light, soft yellow bouncing off beige walls and gold trim. A generic oil painting hung above the bed, the kind meant to calm you, but never move you. The window overlooked a courtyard full of sycamores trying to hold on to the last of their leaves. It was Houston in late November, still humid during the day, but at night the air pinched your skin just enough to make you grateful for sleeves. My dress was sleeveless. I adjusted the straps, stepped back from the mirror. It fit. Of course it did. Tailored, like always. The kind of detail my mother would notice, but never compliment. She'd texted that morning, "Be kind tonight. It's his evening." I hadn't replied. The speech was 5 paragraphs long, polished, polite. The kind of thing a grateful daughter would say about her retiring father. I'd printed it in Georgia font, size 12, double-spaced, just in case the lighting was poor. I stared at it now, willing it to feel like mine. But it didn't. Micah had texted too. "You sure you want to go?" He never pushed. That was his gift, and his flaw. I sat at the vanity, brushing my hair into something presentable. My eyes found the box again. The velvet had thinned at the corners. I reached for it slowly, as if it might bite. My fingers hesitated at the clasp. I remembered the first time I built something that flew. Not a paper plane or one of those plastic gliders they sold at gas stations, but a real, ugly, marvelous drone. 5th grade, salvaged parts from a garage sale in Katy. The body was cardboard reinforced with popsicle sticks, the propellers uneven, the battery pack duct-taped into place. I'd gotten it to hover for 15 seconds. I showed it to Dad. He nodded once. "Try balancing the thrust vectors," he said, like I was a junior intern at his firm. Later, Mom tucked the drone away in the linen closet. Said, "He'll come around." Someday. 1 week later, I heard her on the phone with Aunt Sharon. "She's got her father's stubborn streak, but none of his warmth," she'd said. I was sitting behind the stairs. She didn't know I was home early. The drone stayed in that closet for years. Eventually, I forgot about it. Until the summer before college. I found it when I was packing, still intact, but missing one propeller. I'd held it like a relic, part anger, part reverence. Mom passed by the room. She looked in, paused, and said, "You always wanted him to say, 'Good job,' but maybe it wasn't his way." Then she added, almost to herself, "Some men measure love in silence." I'd said nothing, just closed the lid of the box and packed it in the bottom of my suitcase. That drone now sat in a shadow box in my Denver apartment, an exhibit of quiet defiance. The green box creaked open. Inside, a photo. Science Fair, 1999. Me in a yellow windbreaker, standing beside a trifold board and the drone 2.0. Dad had taken the picture. I knew because Mom would have told me to smile. In the reflection of the mirror, I saw a woman who had crossed orbit lines and dotted the surface of Mars with rovers. But tonight, could barely walk into a ballroom without wondering if she belonged. I ran my finger along the photo's curled edge, tucked it back in, closed the lid. That Sunday night came back to me again, uninvited. I was 12. Dean had just kicked the winning field goal for his middle school team. Dad had clapped him on the back, said he had ice in his veins. I'd waited until dessert to mention the regional robotics trophy. He blinked. "That's good. Focus on grades." I had. Now I pressed my palm flat against the box. Tonight, I'll find out if he remembers. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air still but not quiet. Outside the door, a cart rolled past, the clink of glassware, the distant voice of a bellhop. I remembered staying at this same hotel the night before my Rice interview. Same carpet pattern, same floral soap in the bathroom. Mom had sat beside me while I practiced my mock presentation on planetary motion. She'd brought oranges from home because she said hotel fruit was tasteless. I hadn't thought about that in years. The past had a scent here, a weight. I reached for the speech again, read it twice, smiled without humor, folded it sharply along the center line. I stood, adjusted the hem of the dress, reached for my clutch, checked my phone. The dress fit. The speech didn't. I left it on the desk. When Dad raised his glass and said, "To the sons who carried this name," I knew exactly what came next and what wouldn't. My glass was half full, water, nothing more. I held it like a prop, the coolness sweating through my grip. Around me, the ballroom murmured with delight, the clink of glasses, the flutter of polite laughter. I stayed near the buffet table, half shielded by a potted ficus and the towering dessert cart. My dress, navy, structured, felt more like armor than fabric. Above us, suspended from the vaulted ceiling, was a wireframe replica of the OrbNet satellite. Its solar panels gleamed in the dim golden light. I remembered helping design the relay system that kept its orbit steady, but no one here knew that. Tonight wasn't about me. Dad's toast hung in the air like a thread of smoke. To the sons who carried this name. His voice had that practiced cadence, warm but self-assured, the kind that closed conversations before they began. Dean grinned, his arms slung around Eli's shoulders. I watched them receive the spotlight like it was a familiar inheritance. Mom didn't smile, not fully. From her seat in the center table, she glanced at me once, eyes unreadable, then turned back to her wine. He once told a colleague I dabbled in satellites. I'd spent 18 months on that project, presented in front of the Joint Space Operations Command. My name was printed, spelled correctly, for once, on the summary brief. When I told him, he asked if I was still doing the NASA thing. Then he chuckled and said, "You always had a flair for the arts." That man nodded, like I'd just shown him a pottery wheel. I took a small plate from the end of the buffet, stacked with shrimp cocktail. They glistened under the soft lights. Junior year, I made shrimp skewers for a school project. Mom had helped me skewer them just right. I remembered the pride I felt plating them on our chipped blue porcelain. Dad took one bite. "Too much cayenne," he muttered, and reached for the breadbasket. The speech continued behind me, each word rehearsed, yet seemingly spontaneous. I've been blessed with children who've shown me what legacy means, each in their own way. Even now, he made sure to sound generous. But I knew the ellipse he left in his sentences. The names are not said. I took a slow step toward the dessert table. Cheesecake bites, chocolate mousse, tiny lemon tarts. Nothing too rich, nothing messy. I tapped my heel lightly against the marble floor. The sound was lost in applause. And then I remembered Eli's 18th birthday. It was at the same country club. Balloons in navy and silver, banners with his name, even a slideshow that opened with baby pictures and ended with his acceptance letter to UT Austin. Dad stood to make a speech, 8 minutes long. He joked, he wept, he praised Eli's leadership on the swim team, his natural curiosity, his potential. I was in the 5th row. When he listed family contributions, he thanked Mom for organizing the event and Dean for running the AV. Then, "And Nora took the pictures." That was it. The room clapped. I had smiled through it. Have you ever smiled through a moment that broke something quietly inside you? The kind of moment when you realize your presence was more decoration than recognition. If that's ever been you, drop a comment number 7 below. Now, let's see what happened next. Tonight's speech had that same energy. The performance of pride with omissions tucked neatly under the tablecloth. I moved toward the podium, each step deliberate. My purse swung gently at my side. I could feel the weight of the green velvet box inside. More memory than object. The applause faded into ambient murmurs as Dad wrapped up his speech with a quote about exploration and purpose. The slideshow behind him now cycled faster. Photos of him with astronauts, mission patches, awards, men in suits, rockets. No family snapshots, no birthdays, no science fairs. Certainly no picture of a 12-year-old girl holding a first-place ribbon next to a cardboard drone. When he saw me approach, he didn't smile, didn't frown either. Just that fractional delay in recognition. A flicker of confusion behind the eyes. I stopped 2 feet from the podium. The box came out of my purse like a stone surfacing. I didn't touch the mic. I didn't need to. "From the child you never quite figured out," I said, my voice just above the room's hum. Clear, steady. The silence was immediate. No gasp, no mutter, just attention folding in on itself. Dean blinked, frozen mid-laugh. Eli looked toward Mom, who said nothing. I turned. Walked slowly toward the edge of the room, past guests whose names I half remembered. I didn't flinch when someone called, "Nora!" behind me. At the coat check, I paused, adjusted the strap of my purse. There was a mirror there, full length, trimmed in brass. I looked at myself. My reflection held its breath. I didn't look back, because I knew exactly what I wouldn't find in his face. The farther we drove from Houston, the easier it was to breathe. The city lights faded behind us like a dream I wasn't sorry to wake from. Even the hum of the car felt gentler, less insistent than the orchestra of expectations that had filled that ballroom the night before. Micah didn't speak. He knew better than to prod a silence that still had meaning in it. I held the latte he'd picked up for me, cinnamon, my favorite. He didn't need to ask what I wanted. He never did. It was one of the first things I loved about him, back when we were still hiding from my father's opinions in college cafeterias. The coffee warmed my hands. My heart was taking a little longer. Micah glanced over. "Music or no music?" "No music," I said. The rhythm of the road was enough. We stopped at a gas station on the edge of Seabrook. One of those old ones with a faded Texaco sign, the kind you'd think was abandoned if the lights weren't still flickering. I hadn't been here in over 20 years. The pumps hadn't aged well. Neither had the memories. I stepped out, pretending to stretch. But really, I was just looking. The canopy above the station still had that dent from the hailstorm in '98. I was 14, soaked to the bone after waiting nearly an hour for Dad to pick me up after the STEM state finals. First place, statewide. He forgot. When he finally showed up, he left the engine running and asked, "Did you win?" I said yes. He grunted and muttered something about getting Chinese food on the way home. No hug, no picture. He didn't even look at the trophy box on my lap. I stared now at the same patch of asphalt where I'd stood, shivering in my sneakers, the rain dripping off the brim of my baseball cap. I'd promised myself then that I'd never wait for him again. Micah tapped the roof of the car gently. "Need a second?" I nodded. He didn't ask why. He just went inside to pay, letting the silence settle the way good people do, without trying to fill it. When I got back in, the leather seat felt warmer than before. My fingers rested on the ring box in my coat pocket. Simple silver bands, no diamonds, no fanfare. Just promise. We drove the last stretch in quiet. The air changed. You can always tell when the salt starts to sneak into your lungs. Galveston didn't try to impress. It just was. The chapel sat near the edge of the bay, nestled between two dunes and a rusted anchor someone had turned into a planter. White wood, peeling paint, a porch that creaked under our steps. Inside, the lights were dim. 3 pews. 1 altar. A minister who looked like he'd seen everything and judged nothing. He asked for our names. We gave them. He asked if anyone was here to object. We smiled. Micah took my hand during the vows. His thumb brushed over mine, anchoring me. His voice didn't shake. Mine did, a little. When it was time for the rings, I reached into my coat. The box clicked softly. He slid the band onto my finger, and I looked him dead in the eye. "You never made me feel like a second draft." He kissed my knuckles, slow, reverent. Outside, the wind picked up. The sky was a soft, moody gray, the kind that used to make me anxious. Now it just felt like a clean slate. We stood by the railing overlooking the water. No music, no confetti, no speeches about legacy or sons carrying names. We didn't elope to rebel. We eloped to breathe. Mom texted, "Just let us know you're safe." I was. That wasn't the problem. The message blinked on my phone screen as the waves tapped softly against the shoreline. I was standing at the kitchen counter in our Galveston apartment, trying to decide whether to reply or pretend I hadn't seen it. It wasn't hard to ignore messages. It was harder to ignore what they meant. The apartment was quiet, save for the low crackle of the old radio Micah had found at a flea market. Jazz hummed faintly through the static, a kind of background rhythm to the thoughts I wasn't ready to speak. Outside, the sea looked like melted slate under a cloudy November sky. It felt too calm for the unrest inside me. Micah poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "You slept better," he said, a note of hope laced in his voice. "I slept," I replied, not unkindly. He didn't push. That was one of the reasons I married him. He didn't ask for performances. I sat at the tiny table by the window, my hands wrapped around the warm mug. Across from me, Micah sipped in silence, his eyes on the horizon. We didn't talk about the wedding. We didn't talk about who wasn't there. My phone vibrated again, this time a voicemail. "Eli." I didn't press play yet. Instead, I opened the small drawer by the fridge, pulling out a stack of stationery I hadn't touched since college. I began to write, "Hi, Mom, We're okay. The place is small, but the light's good. Micah found a used bookshelf and fixed it before I noticed the bottom was warped. He's still like that. There's a beach trail we walk every evening. It's quiet here. You'd like it. I don't know what to say about the other night, but I'm thinking about it. I stopped. I didn't sign it. I didn't fold it. I just left the letter on the counter, unfinished, like the thoughts that led to it. Later that afternoon, we walked to the pier. The wind pulled at my scarf, and the salt air stung in a way that reminded me I was still healing. Micah stopped by a vendor cart and handed me a paper cup. The cinnamon latte made me smile. "You remembered." "I always do," he said. We sat on a bench near the edge, looking out at the churn of the sea. I turned to him and asked, "Do you ever regret it?" He shook his head. "Number because you don't." It was then I told him about the time my father had Micah's name removed from the acknowledgement page of our paper on orbital resistance. He said it'd look better if it came from a single author, I said. A family name. Micah smiled faintly. I kept the draft. It's in my sock drawer. Later that evening, I opened a box Mom had left at my apartment years ago. It was wedged beneath a stack of moving books. Inside was an old album, bound in green cloth, edges fraying. I hadn't opened it in ages. Flipping through, I found a photo of myself at 16, hair chopped to my ears, wearing the blue tech team uniform with grease smudged on my collar. I remembered the day vividly. We'd won second place at regionals, and I came home to find the door locked. I sat on the porch for an hour until Mom returned from the store. She had that album under her arm and said, "Smile just once," for me. Under the photo, she'd written in faded ink, "My girl. My gravity." I touched the edge of the image, letting the memory sink like sediment. Mom never said much when Dad cut me off mid-sentence, but she always waited up when I came home late from the lab. And she never missed my exhibitions, even if she had to stand in the back. That night, I finally played Eli's voicemail. His voice cracked once, early. "He's not angry, Nora. He's just quieter now. I don't think he expected silence from you." He paused before finishing. "Just come by the house." Just once. I held the phone to my chest, the air in the apartment growing still around me. I stared at the dark window, the glass reflecting nothing but myself. I looked at the car keys on the counter. I didn't sleep right away that night. I stood in the kitchen after Micah had gone to bed, the light above the stove casting long shadows. The letter still sat unfolded on the counter. I picked it up, read it again, and thought about what wasn't in it. There was a night once, years ago, when Mom and I stayed up baking cookies because I couldn't sleep before the science fair. I was 17. I just learned Dad wouldn't be coming, that he had a business trip to D.C., the dough stuck to my fingers, and the first batch burned. But Mom made tea, and we sat on the floor while she told me about the time she skipped college orientation just to take care of her own mother. "You don't need everyone to see you," she said, tapping my chest. "Just the ones who matter." I wonder if she knew then how much I needed her to be louder. The sea wind pushed against the windows now. I pulled the curtain closed and ran my hand over the photo album one more time. That inscription, "My girl, my gravity," felt like something I had to believe again. I poured the rest of the coffee down the sink, rinsed the mugs, and set them on the drying rack. Then I folded the letter, not to mail it, but to place it inside the album, next to the photo of me at 16. Maybe someday I'd let her read it. Maybe someday I'd write a better one. But not tonight. I didn't know if I was ready to forgive, but I did know how to drive home without GPS. Have you ever reached a point where you no longer needed permission to move forward? When clarity doesn't come from answers, but from choosing your own direction. If that moment ever found you, leave a number 5 in the comments. Let's keep going. He opened the door before I knocked. "You're early," he said. Same as always. No hug. The threshold felt like a fault line. One step over, and I was back inside the house I once believed would never change. It hadn't. The same couch with cracked leather arms, the wall of framed commendations, and grainy black and white military photos. The clock above the mantel still ran 5 minutes fast. Dad's nod to staying ahead. I followed him inside without taking off my coat. The scent of old wood polish and weak coffee greeted me like an awkward relative. Mom appeared from the kitchen with a tray, her eyes pausing on mine just long enough to say, "I see you," without words. She set the tea down and gently touched my wrist. "He kept the drone in the attic. You should take it back." I nodded, not yet ready for gratitude or questions. Dad sat in his usual chair, the one near the window where he could see the neighbor's flag. I took the seat across from him. Between us sat the tray. Neither of us reached for it. "I heard about the ceremony," he said. "The one in D.C. "It was streamed," I answered. "The link was public." He said nothing to that. I looked around the room. No sign of my existence hung on these walls. No graduation photo, no childhood crayon drawing, just rows of medals and a framed newspaper article about Eli's med school award. "Did you even watch the summit speech?" His jaw flexed. "Twice!" That stunned me more than I let on. I adjusted the hem of my sleeve and leaned back. He reached into the drawer by his side. For a moment, I thought he might produce a folder, a lecture, something rehearsed. Instead, it was a photo. Slightly faded, corners curled. He handed it over, not meeting my eyes. I stared. It was me. 13, maybe 14, standing next to my first full-functioning robot. I was beaming, hair a mess, wrench still in one hand. And behind me, his hand on my shoulder, stood Dad. I didn't remember this picture being taken. I didn't remember him being there. "You kept this?" I asked. He nodded, eyes still on the tray of untouched tea. My father, never let me speak unless it was for applause," he said quietly. I turned the photo over. Nothing written, just blank. "You had your chance to break that cycle," I said. "You didn't." The silence thickened. I half expected denial, some rebuttal, maybe even an apology carefully stripped of emotion. But he just nodded, slowly, once. Then he slid the photo closer to me. The clock ticked too loudly in the background. Mom reappeared and gathered the untouched cups. Her hand brushed my shoulder briefly, just enough. I held the photo in my lap. It felt heavier than it looked. I didn't come here to argue. I didn't come here for closure. But I came, and that counted for something. Before I left, I stood in the hallway a moment longer. The light caught the edges of the staircase. I used to sit there during storms, waiting for them to pass. "Will you keep in touch?" Mom asked softly, following me to the door. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing leaves down the sidewalk like scattered thoughts. Dad stood behind her, silent, just watching. I stayed in the hallway a little longer, letting the quiet press in from all sides. My eyes landed on the staircase, and I remembered the last time I stood in this exact spot, 17 years old, hand trembling as I held out the scholarship letter I'd been so proud of. "I think you should read it out loud," I'd said then. "It's from MIT. Dad had taken the envelope from me, peeled it open carefully. He read it silently, then folded it back up and handed it to me. "Good. Focus on logistics, not the politics of science." That was all. The memory hit me now like cold wind through a cracked window. I shook it off and turned toward the attic. Mom didn't stop me. She only said, "The latch sticks. Wiggle it left first." Micah didn't come with me this time. This was a solo retrieval. The attic smelled of cedar and mothballs. Dust motes drifted in the beam of the small lamp I held. Everything was just where it had been when I moved out. Boxes labeled Christmas, Dad's uniforms, Eli's baby things. In the far corner, under an old blanket, I found it. The drone. Its frame was smaller than I remembered, painted a chipped navy blue with my initials etched near the motor casing. I touched the side panel and remembered the long nights soldering wires while my friends were out dancing or dating. This drone had won me a statewide tech prize, and Dad hadn't come to the ceremony, but he hadn't thrown it out. I carried it downstairs like an artifact. He was still in the chair, his fingers laced over his stomach now, eyes not closed, but distant. "I'm taking this," I said, holding up the drone. He blinked. "I figured you would." I paused by the door again. "You know, it still flies." "I never doubted it." We stood there in the quiet. No music, no apologies, just old air between us. Outside, Mom followed me to the porch. "You were always his mystery," she said, "but he kept more than you know." I didn't ask what, not yet. In the car, I set the drone on my lap. The plastic was cool, but it carried heat from memory. Micah didn't ask how it went. He just reached over, started the engine, and waited. I turned back once, just in time to see the porch light flicker on behind them. Maybe that was their way of waving. Maybe it was enough, for now. He didn't deny it. He just nodded, and placed the photo in my hand. I hung the photo on my wall, not because he gave it to me, because I finally knew it was mine. Morning light streamed through the thin curtains of our apartment in Galveston, casting long, pale rectangles across the wooden floor. The photo rested in a simple black frame, centered between two others. One from our quiet beach wedding, me barefoot, Micah smiling in the wind, and one from 1999, me holding the trophy at the state science fair with my robot beside me and a crooked grin stretching across my face. There was one more, a candid of my mother in her 20s, holding me on her hip, a note taped beneath it in her handwriting, "My girl, my gravity." The radio hummed low jazz from the kitchen. Micah was already up, cradling his mug, reading the paper like a man twice his age. He looked up, smiled, and nodded toward the stove. "There's still coffee." I nodded, pulling on a sweater before joining him. My hands moved on autopilot, pour, stir, sip, but the weight in my chest didn't feel heavy anymore. It was more like the deep stretch after a long night's sleep, present but not painful. My laptop was already open from the night before. An unread email blinked in bold. The subject line read, "Question from a student." I clicked it. "Hi, Ms. Evers," it began. "I saw your talk from the Aerospace Summit last month. I watched it with my dad. He said engineering is a man's discipline. But when you spoke, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time. Permission. How did you know when to walk away from what didn't see you?" I leaned back in my chair, letting the words hang in the air. Micah glanced over, but didn't interrupt. The wind from the sea whispered through the cracked kitchen window, lifting the corner of the tablecloth. I typed slowly. "You don't always know," I wrote. "You just stop asking." I stared at the sentence, letting its honesty settle. Then I added, "And when you stop asking, you begin building something that doesn't require permission to stand." I hit send. Later that morning, I climbed the narrow stairwell to the little loft we used as storage. The drone sat quietly in the corner, Same navy blue paint chipping at the edges. Same etched initials near the base. I didn't fix it. I didn't even dust it off. I simply carried it downstairs and placed it gently on the sideboard beneath the framed photos. It didn't need to fly again. It had already proven itself. Micah stepped beside me, coffee in hand. "Looks right there," he said. "It does," I answered. We stood in silence a while longer. Not the strained silence of withheld words, but the kind that settles when everything that needed saying had already been said. I took a cloth and wiped the glass over the 1999 photo. My teenage face smiled back at me, eyes wide with ambition and something else, something that no longer waited for approval. I caught my reflection in the glass. No longer the daughter who waited for an audience, for a nod, for her place at a table already set. I was a woman who had built her own table, who chose what to keep and what to leave. I stepped back and looked at the wall again. 3 photos. 3 versions of me. And for the first time, they didn't feel like contradictions. They felt like chapters in a book I had finally decided to finish. I moved to the mirror near the door. My hair was pulled back, loose and easy. No makeup, no mask. I looked myself straight in the eyes. I didn't see a daughter. I saw someone who had walked through fire and built a house from the ashes. The kettle whistled just as I turned from the mirror. Back in the kitchen, Micah had started slicing apples for breakfast, humming off key to the radio. It was ordinary, and in that ordinariness, I found comfort I never knew I needed. "I told Eli I might visit after the new year," I said, breaking the silence. Micah looked up, surprised, but not pushing. "That sounds like a good step." "I don't want a confrontation, just a visit," I said. "You don't owe anyone anything," he replied, handing me a slice. "But you can still offer something if it's yours to give." I let the apple sit on my tongue a while before chewing. He was right. That was the difference now. I wasn't walking in with empty hands or empty hope. I was walking in with something whole. Later that afternoon, I found a worn notebook in the drawer next to the couch. My old designs for modular orbital rigs were scribbled across the pages. I flipped through them, smiling at the sharp angles and youthful certainty of the pen strokes. I had forgotten how many dreams I once thought needed his blessing to matter. I bookmarked one of the pages and set it beside my laptop. Maybe I'd build again. Maybe not for awards or grants, but for students like the girl who emailed me this morning. For the girl I used to be. As the sun dipped low, casting golden lines across the apartment walls, I stood in front of the framed photos again. I placed a tiny slip of paper behind the drone. First flight, October 2001. It was a small note, invisible to most. But I'd know it was there. I didn't need a ceremony. I didn't need an inheritance. I had legacy, in fingerprints, in soldier burns, in sentences whispered into the hearts of girls watching summit talks from their bedrooms, and most of all, in the decision to stay soft, stay steady, and stay. The light faded. I turned off the radio, dimmed the kitchen light, and sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. No fanfare. Just breathe. Just peace. Not every apology arrives in time. But healing isn't about timing. It's about choosing what stays. It's strange how peace doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it arrives when you stop needing them. I spent years chasing a nod that never came, only to learn that some legacies are built not by being seen, but by seeing yourself. I've come to believe that forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. It's about making space inside your life for something better to grow. And maybe that's enough. If any part of my story resonates with you, I hope it gives you a little room to breathe, and maybe to begin again in your own way. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just a quiet corner to return to. Thank you for walking this road with me. I'll see you again in another story.